It's about an intelligence operation into an organization called People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, PAGAD. A high number of assassinations of very prominent gang leaders. When there was a lot of pressure on a certain cell, they would go quiet. This is a political, ideological campaign attached to violence. People didn't believe that this was a serious threat. At some point, it was very clearly an anti-state, where you could say this is terrorism.
Hello everybody, this is Underworlds and I'm Mark Shaw. In Underworlds, I've been speaking to lots of interesting authors and others responding to the issue of organized crime. And today I'm speaking with David Africa, somebody who I've known for quite some time and who's written a very interesting book which sold well in South Africa. And it talks about the intelligence campaign against an organization called People Against Gangsterism and Drugs. What's so interesting about David's book is that there's been a lot written about intelligence activities during apartheid, both from the state side and the campaign against the apartheid state, but there's very little, if anything, written about intelligence, in this case, police intelligence in the democracy. And David has very strong views on that. I know from engaging with him over the years, and the book is a very interesting summary and insight into a kind of action-packed moment in South African history. David, welcome to Underworlds. It's really a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for the invitation.
David, I wonder, I'm saying I know something about you, but whether you wouldn't, before we talk about the book, just say very briefly something about yourself. What's your background? How did you end up in the police? You were not originally a police officer. I think you had no sense of becoming a police officer. How did you get there? How did you get involved in the intelligence world?
So, Mark, in the 1980s, as a student, that's to say a high school student, I was active in student and broader liberation politics in Cape Town. And at that time was recruited into the underground of the then banned ANC, where, amongst other things, I was doing political intelligence for the ANC and was recruited into its army and trained, obviously, in intelligence and a number of other things. As you say, at the time, I mean, in the 80s, we had no idea that, a few years later, there would be a democratic transition. And very few of us, I think myself definitely didn't plan to become a police officer or actually work anywhere in the state.
Did you ever think it was possible that you would be a police officer, David?
No, never. I mean, my mother wanted me to become a doctor, and she was greatly disappointed when I didn't. I mean, policing or actually working as a bureaucrat, in any kind of a securocrat was just not on the radar for me. So anyway, I left the country to undergo military training, came back after the election in 1994, and it was just sort of logical that I would join the army. But I decided not to because I had no interest, excuse me, in being in the military. So I went back to civilian life. But then somehow I ended up in police intelligence. I mean, sort of, in a very Gramscian way, a combination of coercion and convincing. I ended up in intelligence, as sort of deployment by the ANC at the time.
David, this is the book, obviously, you know it, Lives on the Line. You say in the book, which is very interesting, that you couldn't have written this immediately afterwards, that actually 20 years had to pass before you were able to put pen to paper, begin to draw lessons, begin to tell the story. I mean, tell us about that. Why did you write the book? Was it challenging to write? What kind of process was it? And then we'll turn to the story itself.
Yeah, so I actually started writing immediately after I left government in what, 2001. I took up the book again. Actually, I mean, your book or the conversations around your book was, and it was also an impulse for me to then write this book, and sort of encouragement by friends and family and so on. But it was quite emotionally exacting, actually, because obviously I was writing about a very difficult period in which I was personally involved as a central character. And so that was quite, and I mean, I could feel it, as I was writing it, the sort of emotional sort of strain, of thinking back about the events and so on.
If you haven't read the book, what David does is very unusually from an intelligence perspective, particularly in South Africa, but generally, he tells the story of his role, the success and the failures, quite bluntly. And then at the end, there's a kind of annex, I don't know if that's the right word, which is more drawing lessons, which I also want to discuss. David, don't you want to tell people what PAGAD was, what Qibla was, what your interpretation was? I mean, what's the story fundamentally about? And having, you mentioned my own book on the subject, one of the things I was very struck by was how few people had written about this, how few people were even concerned about it, how few people in some cases even remembered what is a sustained campaign of bombing and violence in the early days of South Africa's democracy.
It's about an intelligence operation conducted by a police intelligence unit into an organization called People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, PAGAD, which was a front for a militant organization that had existed in Cape Town, in South Africa actually, since 1979, Qibla. And they had initiated a campaign, which on the face of it was a campaign, as the name says, against gangsterism and drugs in Cape Town. There was a very, I mean, initially concealed, but later became more obvious political motive behind this campaign, which was to basically destabilize the emerging democratic government and the constitutional order. And so it's a story of a small unit of intelligence officers conducting an operation against, I mean, what we characterized then as a terrorist target in Cape Town, and it spread to other parts of South Africa later on as well.
So you're joining this uniformed organization coming from a very different kind of organization. Give us a sense of what that was like. And this is a relatively authoritarian structure with a particular bureaucratic history. And you come into this, you turn to the issue of PAGAD quite early on, as I understand it from the book.
20 of us in Cape Town, 100 and some odd nationally, from the ANC's Intelligence and Security Directorate, joins what is now called Crime Intelligence Division in the police. When we get there, obviously we are now merging 20 of us with a much larger number of existing officers in crime intelligence. This is the former security branch of the apartheid regime in the 1980s and early 90s. Now, it's interesting, obviously, because almost all of us who join were targets of this security branch in the 80s and 90s. And we will now be working with these people, the people who literally by name knew us and we knew them as adversaries previously. So that was an interesting dynamic because obviously one has to adjust, and amongst us were people who were captured, sent to prison, tortured, and so on by actually most of us by the security branch. So that adjustment took quite some time, but I would say it was easier than at least I expected. Not that it was smooth, but I think we were fortunate in the sense that there were a number of personalities involved who made something that seemed impossible actually just happen, and it happening, that is to say, working together was an achievement in itself.
What's really fascinating about the book for me is it's not only an operational intelligence book, It's about changing the way the state analyzed what the problem was. At least that's how I have read it. And you were doing both. I mean, tell us a little bit about that.
It came to my desk, as it were, literally my desk, as a newspaper clipping about a march that had happened in Cape Town, and that my commander at the time wanted me to have a look at. Now, at this time, there was no one looking at, uh, I mean, what later was called, Muslim extremism or Islamic militancy or whatever. No one was spending any time on that in intelligence. I mean, across the board. I'm given this thing, and as far as I can see, it's a newspaper report about the march, which I then obviously try to find out what is this thing about, and what were people marching about, and who's organizing this. In doing so, I find out that there is a sort of political movement behind this, which is obviously not unusual. I mean, in South Africa, people are marching all the time. But I then decide to scratch. And the more I scratch, the more I find out that this is not just political. People are collecting weapons, it's the illegal weapons. People are training in small groups in the use of these weapons and so on. And this then obviously becomes a concern, which I try to highlight in reports, but is largely ignored. I think partially between, let's say, an extreme opposition to targeting a political organization, obviously, which would be controversial at the time, as we are just coming into a democracy, and partially because there was very little understanding of the political religious kind of militancy which was now emerging. These reports were mostly ignored, and not acted upon.
You make some comments about the analytical, let's call it tradition of the security branch, that people were reporting incidents upwards, sort of under a veneer of analysis, right? Is the terminology you
Yes.
use. Why do you think that was the case? And you make, well, you describe how you started to do more analysis and later did a very big analytical product. I mean, give us a sense of analytically how the state turned.
The people we were working with, meaning the former security branch people, came from, let's call it a tradecraft, but it's much cruder than that. That was very short on analysis, because the targets were very tactical. What was the main target was tracking what they call terrorists and tracking these people, arresting or killing them. The more higher level strategic intelligence, which is to say, how are activities we are seeing linked to grander strategic maneuvers by a political organization? They did not have that ability. A lot of that analytic work previously was done by the NIS, the National Intelligence Service, and the branch had a very poor analytic tradecraft. And the other thing is that being in the police, their focus was mostly on incidents. Like so many incidents happening here and so many incidents there, but not deep analysis. Now, without having been trained formally as an analyst, obviously I came from a background where one was trained to think strategically and politically, which meant that you had the ability to connect things in the grander sense of activity. So this is what I try to introduce and to create, let's say, a big picture of how these various things, marches, people training, speeches being made about the illegitimacy of the democratically elected government, alliances being built, how these were part of a broader strategic dynamic. And it took time to convince people actually of, let's say, of that picture of the reality.
The organization that you first hear about through a newspaper clipping, your commander tells you to go, things turn very violent very fast. And I mean, explain the extent of the violence, because this was a major campaign of violence not ostensibly initially, as you say, targeted at the state, but at some point there's a sort of spasm, and the state becomes a target, and he's almost shocked by that. I mean, just give people an understanding of the extent of what began to unfold.
So the initial targets of PAGAD's campaign were mostly gang leaders and drug dealers. By the second half of 96, because they were now organized in cell structures, they had moved to acquiring hand grenades, for example, obviously, which was a sign of an intent to carry out more lethal operations. And in fact, it happened so that they escalated the violence, still within the same target set, so gang leaders, drug dealers. And so a high number of assassinations of very prominent gang leaders. I mean, many leaders of the big Cape Town gangs. As you know, the Rashad Staghi was one of the leaders of the Hard Livings gang, Jackie Lonte of the Americans, and so on. What then happened was that there was an escalation into attacks and let's say a diversification of the target set beyond gangsters now to first Muslims who were critical of PAGAD. So academics, other religious figures being intimidated, threatened, attacked, right? So Ibrahim Musa was a professor at UCT. His house was bombed. He had to leave the country, went to the US into exile, basically. Muslim businessmen who did not want to contribute financially to PAGAD were targeted, a number of them assassinated. And then there was a shift towards targeting the state itself, bombing government offices, raiding police stations to seize weapons from the police armories, killing police investigators, magistrates, presiding over PAGAD cases and so on. So, and then more publicly in terms of tourist infrastructure, shopping malls, there was an escalation in the lethality of attacks, the kinds of weapons being introduced intended to be, to cause more casualties, but also a broadening of who they were targeting. And at some point, it was very clearly an anti-state, where you could say this is terrorism.
What's the ideology of that? And actually, people still ask me, well, what was the point of the attacks 2 or 3 years into the new democracy? What was the justification for it? I mean, do you have a clear articulation of that?
So in the first instance, the settlement of 1994 was regarded as illegitimate, and the state then a target, a credible and legitimate target. On the other hand, having realized the success of their campaign, which started initially with gangsters and drug dealers, there was a sort of momentum happening, right? Which inevitably was going to lead to an escalation to the point where the state itself becomes a target. But they always regarded the state as illegitimate.
You discover this, you start to make the argument within the police and within the state that this is a direct threat to the state. What's the response that you get?
People didn't believe that this was a serious threat, or that it could become one. So obviously, initially, there's some incidents and so on, and one is forecasting and analyzing that this is part of a bigger scheme, but the scheme is not clear yet. And too many people in the intelligence community at the time looked at this dynamic as if they were ordinary people, not intelligence officers. So it was regarded as sort of non-credible, that is not a serious threat. The same applied initially at the political level, that there was a skepticism about both the ability of Qibla and PAGAD to actually escalate to the point where this becomes a serious problem, and about the claim, which I was making amongst others, that this is a political ideological campaign attached to violence. I mean, there were a number of incidents which sort of got people more and more to understand that maybe this is a serious thing. One of which was the incident at the house of the former Minister of Justice, Tala Umar, in Cape Town, where they sort of, stormed into his house and so on, which was early 1996. And then the big thing really was the lynching in public of Rashad Staghi in August 96, which obviously drew a lot of media attention, and so had the politicians at least sitting up and saying, well, there seems to be something happening here and we need to look at it.
I mean, on your estimate, what numbers of, just to give people a sense of what we're talking about, how many bombings, what number of people roughly were killed in this sort of violent spasm in the early days of South Africa's democracy?
If I recall, I was never too interested in the exact numbers, but there were several hundred bombings. I mean, some of them were small pipe bombs and so on. Then obviously later on, there were car bombs, but several hundred of those. I would imagine at least 150 people must have been killed, mostly through shootings. Not many people died in the bombings, actually, fortunately. So most people were killed in shooting incidents, and these became more indiscriminate as they went on, because initially they would target, let's say, a gang leader and kill the gang leader. But later on, if you were a gang leader, they would come into your house and kill whoever was there, women and children and so on. So a large number of people were actually killed in this campaign of violence.
But at the heart of the book is the story of how this small group of intelligence officers begins to respond under quite a lot of stress, because in a way the state began to recognize this was a real threat. There was enormous political pressure building on you, and it would be interesting to hear how that was conveyed to you. And so with not a lot of resources, human or technical or necessarily financial, you began an intelligence response.
Most of the pressure came from ourselves, in the sense that we felt this situation had to be put to an end. We, as members of the team ourselves.
And the team is mixed, David. It's a mix of old order, new order people, or is it mainly a new order crowd?
The team is led by former ANC people. So this is the undercover operations unit of crime intelligence, so the covert intelligence unit, as it's commonly called, which is led by, the senior staff are all ANC, former ANC or ANC operatives that had been integrated into crime intelligence. But the staff is varied. ANC people, former security branch people. So it's an integrated team, and actually that in itself is a fascinating dynamic in how we came to build a very potent team from these, previously antagonistic backgrounds. But the pressure is mostly from ourselves. At some point, obviously, and it starts with the murder of Staghi in August 1996. Because of the media hype around it, there is now political pressure from the ministry, the presidency, and so on. And it becomes persistent from then on. Various police ministers. First, it's Mufamadi, and then Steve Tshwete as police minister. But, Minister of Justice, the president, the national security advisor to the president. So there are all these efforts to let's say, resolve the problem. Most of them fail.
And there's police investigators, right? You are not the only people working on it. For the first response is, in fact, not you.
We are not even the only intelligence people in the police, because remember, we are part of a small unit in the larger crime intelligence. So other crime intelligence units are also working on it. There's pressure on everyone from the police perspective. But over time, that pressure comes exclusively to us, to the unit that I am in, because it is quite clear that this is the unit that one has developed an appreciation of the problem and has capability in the sense that, we have recruited some useful sources and so on. So,
Can I ask, sorry to interrupt, but is it partly because there's greater trust between you in the unit as former ANC guys with ANC politicians? Is that the issue? Is it a likeness of thinking that and a frustration with the police that drives the responsibility more and more clearly into your lap?
I mean, there are a number of factors. The one is that before the, let's call it the COVID unit, came under the management of former ANC people. I was deployed at the Crime Intelligence Head Office for about a year, where I obviously engaged regularly with the leadership of crime intelligence and with the other agencies. I then went back to Cape Town, so I had the relationship with the Divisional Commissioner of Crime Intelligence and other leadership of crime intelligence in Pretoria. And so there was a relationship which was now between myself, deployed now in Cape Town, back in Cape Town in this COVID unit. And so we could call upon, and people called on them, and they called upon us. And so a lot of the pressure was directed our way because of that relationship. There was a political element to it because, there was trust, pre-existing relationships in the ANC and so on. But also a lot of the difficult intelligence tasks in crime intelligence traditionally was carried by the covert units. These were the sort of units, let's say the elite of crime intelligence at the time, and they dealt with a lot of the complex intelligence operations. So it partially had to do with, just by virtue of it being a covert unit. So there's that pressure, which obviously as PAGAD is, I mean, we are making inroads, but PAGAD is ahead of us because they've had a 2-year head start in building their capability, training their people, developing trust, and so on. So they are 2 years ahead of us. Now, as much as we are progressing, they have built a formidable capability, which is not easy to dismantle.
Give us a sense of that capability.
I mean, at some point, circa 1998, they had about 200, a bit more than 200 people in different cell structures, right? Cells being 3 to 5, sometimes bigger, 10 people. I mean, there was no sort of firm number that they were working with. So they had about 30 cells operating in Cape Town, active, and not all of them at the same time, because they would, let's say, rotate in a way. When there was a lot of pressure on a certain cell, they would go quiet, but others would carry out operations in their stead. So you were dealing with a very capable adversary. They had refined their modus operandi. They had very capable people leading these cells. I mean, you in your book you speak about Ibrahim Jenica, for example. I mean, operationally speaking, a very impressive character, and there were others like him in PAGAD. So because we started 2 years late in doing serious work against PAGAD, we playing catch up. And so the pressure is there because PAGAD is doing more and more. They're escalating, but also it's clear that we are making more and more progress. So the pressure is more directed to us.
And people are getting desperate. There was a moment of desperation, to be honest.
Yes.
David, tell us about, because we otherwise we're going to run out of time without talking at about some of the core issues of the book, the intelligence operations themselves. I mean, just, what form did they take? What were the lessons? I mean, give us, what were the frustrations? What were the big successes? Like, just give us a sense. You don't have to give everything away in respect of what's in the book.
Yeah.
But this is the heart of
Yes.
of the response, of the secret response.
Yeah. Look, I'll start with the frustrations. The biggest frustration we had was that there was no coherence in how crime intelligence was tackling the problem, meaning everyone was trying to solve it, and in the process, everyone was stepping on everyone else's toes. And in the process, also, people were sabotaging each other. So, especially because of the historical sort of legacy between detectives and intelligence people in the police, there were very active attempts to sabotage a lot of the work we did. We obviously, as intelligence people, were always skirting at the edge of the law, because we had to be very, let's say, creative in how we access this organization and so on, without breaking the law. But we were under a lot of pressure. That was our biggest frustration. It was an internal frustration within the police. The other frustration we had actually was the fact that we were working with very antiquated technology. I mean, you have a sort of sense of James Bondish gadgets and so on, but crime intelligence at the time was working with technology that was 30, 40, maybe even 50 years old. We could not move on that front because our approach to the problem was to integrate technology and human intelligence, because we wanted to produce evidence for prosecutions, even though it was not strictly speaking our mandate, but no one else was doing it and capable of doing it. So we just decided to do it. We carried out, I would say, some very spectacular operations, including recruitments, very difficult recruitments of very well-placed people in PAGAD. Obviously, some of these things succeed and others fail and so on. So there were failures necessarily. That's how it is. We were relatively successful on that score.
There's a bit of blackmail used in recruitment, right? And which is a very interesting story. There's sympathy shown to particular people. There's this dramatic moment of stopping a bomb, and then there are prosecutions. Although to be fair, from my own research, they are not as extensive as you would have thought, given the depth of the campaign. But still, the state stops the campaign. Coming to South Africa now, there's a kind of crisis in policing, and as we speak now, the National Commission is suspended. There's, in the last 2 days, very senior intelligence person has been suspended. It's just extraordinary. There's this moment of real crisis within the police. And of course, the sense that the police are rotten, unable to function, the crime intelligence system is broken. What would you say, drawing on of course, your experience and of the PAGAD campaign, if we can call it that, what needs to be done? What's gone wrong?
Well, I wouldn't have much to say about the police, broadly speaking, because I'm not a policing person in that sense. But obviously, there is a poverty of leadership. This is very obvious. I mean, if there wasn't, you wouldn't have the levels of crime that we have in the country. So, I mean, that needs to be addressed quite clearly.
David, on that, can I ask, because the 120 odd ANC people that join, none of them are in the senior leadership of the police. I'm not saying they would, well, would they have been better or worse? I mean, what happened to all of these people? You say there's poverty of leadership, and I think that's correct, and very high levels of corruption. But what went wrong? These people you left, other people left. It's hard to in a sense understand this process that took place over the years.
I mean, what I could say with a great measure of confidence, I think, is that it could not be worse if some of these people were elevated to the more senior ranks of the police. Many of them were hounded out, actually. I mean, even someone like Peter Jacobs, who retired recently as a lieutenant general, was appointed as the head of crime intelligence and hounded out of his job. Not long into his appointment. The same with Jeremy Leary. Anwar Dramat under Zuma's presidency was forced out of his position as the head of the Hawks. So I think, I think that those people had to be retained in the police and appointed into positions where they could make a contribution. Because if I just look at these three individuals, obviously there are others, these are exceptionally skilled people and people who had proven their mettle in very complex investigations. I mean, you know, the investigation to the whole gun running thing in the Western Cape. Anwar was central to resolving the PAGAD thing, Anwar Dramat. So these are the kinds of people that I believe would have made a positive contribution. Um, Obviously, because we were a small number, it's not as you can say, give the police to these ANC people and they will solve it. I mean, it does make sense. But I think, you know, you could have coalesced capabilities around people like them.
But David, I do, the general sense is that the senior police leadership had become too close to the ANC, or at least are not independent of it, but they are not, or they were not in a way.
I get what you're saying, Mark. You see, my reading of this, having worked with these people, is that, look, most of them are old apartheid police people. Their modus is to be close to power, whether it's ANC or whatever. And I think they have played the ANC. Obviously, the ANC has not complained about being played by them, but they are the kind of people who know that they have to attach themselves to power. And they've leveraged that for their own interests, you know, because they are not critical. People like myself and Dramat and Viri and others, people who come from the ANC, we are used to being critical of these ANC leaders. I mean, I am all the time. Um, but they are not, because they maybe it's their training, maybe it's just their disposition and what has taken them up in the ranks. But surely none of us went up in ranks by kowtowing to the ANC. If you just look at the people I've named here. So there's a symbiotic relationship that is developed between corrupt ANC leaders and these old apartheid cops who have attached themselves to the ANC because they are found and they are speaking as if they've been in the ANC for 40 years, all of them. So you know that relationship has to be broken. I mean, the ANC has no business running the police. These people also have no business going to the ANC and sort of offering themselves as a capability to the ANC. They are supposed to be serving the state and the citizenry.
David, the turning quickly to crime intelligence, the sense is it's broken, it's rotten, it's it's not showing its impact. Is it fixable? I mean, is it worth just dismantling the whole thing now, starting again?
Well, Mark, I don't think it's fixable because, firstly, it is too bloated. You know, you have a crime intelligence northwards of 8,000 people. South Africa doesn't need a police intelligence organization with 8,000 people at all. Doesn't need it. Also, by virtue of that number, you are diluting the quality of, let's say, the average crime intelligence officer, because you can't have 8,000 capable crime intelligence officers. It's not possible. So I think my own view, my own very strong view, is that it should be dismantled. And in its stead, a new intelligence, whatever you call it, you know, a police intelligence capability should be established that's much smaller, a more focused mandate, more highly professional, highly skilled, highly trained, and integrating technology as a central part of its work.
Thank you very much, David. It's really been a pleasure to have you on the show. I hold up your book again, Lives on the Line. It's really a good read. I knew you as you were writing it, I think, although of course you started a long time ago, and it's an astonishing read, not only because I learned things about you that I didn't know, but it's a very analytical, predictably look at the problem, but it's also quite a exciting, fast-running story, which then draws lessons at the end. And in a way, for me, it's a story which partly says what might have been. And we've talked at the end about what policing in South Africa now looks like and the real challenges that we face. But in in this book is a kind of kernel of what might have been. I don't know any other way to say it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.